latest video game war is heating up tonight. Nintendo's GameCube system is about to hit the stores. But some lucky people are already playing the games. Kathleen Trigg joins us now with the story. Kathleen?
Well, Rollin, it's all part of a $75 million marketing campaign designed to convince video game fans that GameCube is better than the competition. GameCube is better than the competition.
We're just waiting for the GameCube to come out. Everybody's so anxious to play with it and everything. So,
how is it?
It's pretty good. It's very good.
So what do you think?
It's very realistic. It's better than any other system that I played before.
Sup everybody, it's Sage, and today we are building a Pico Boot GameCube. I've made this tutorial for beginners, though this is an intermediate level mod. Let's start with what you'll need. The Pico Boot kit itself is very inexpensive. I get it on AliExpress, and I get the same one every time. It always works for me. The SD card reader that you choose with your kit is really up to user preference and the actual schematics of your GameCube. If your cube has a serial port 2, you can use the SD to SP2 adapter. If not, then you can use the memory card adapter. Either way, they will both run Swiss directly out of your Raspberry Pi. I think the SD to SP2 is ideal because it gives you the option of using 2 memory cards with your system, but like I said, both will work. The kit will of course also come with a Raspberry Pi. This is obviously the most important part of the Pico Boot mod, but don't underestimate this little 3D printed bracket here. You can install your Pico without it, but then it might wiggle around and break off some loose wires in your system over time. The kit also comes with thermal pads. Some people prefer thermal paste, and that's fine, but these are the right size for the GameCube, and I think they work great. However, the wires that they include with the kit I've had nothing but trouble with. They never seem to work properly, so we're gonna go ahead and just scrap those and use a slightly higher gauge wire. It's not much bigger than the ones they gave you, but just enough to really get some juice into the Pico. And of course, you'll need a soldering station as well as a carbon filter fan so that you don't get asthma like I have. I keep a damp sponge at my soldering station so I can wipe off extra solder between uses. And this stuff here comes in clutch. This is flux. I don't recommend doing this without flux. And of course you're going to need solder. I use a smaller gauge, 0.8 millimeters, that way I don't overload my tip with too much solder. The GameCube is held together with security bits, so you will need this game bit security screwdriver to open the screws on the outer shell casing. You'll also need wire strippers, clippers, and pliers to deal with your wires later. Now go dig in your dad's tool bin for your handy dandy Phillips head. I don't know what I'm doing with it here. Parkour. Anyway, there's some smaller Phillips head screws, so you'll need a smaller Phillips head bit as well. I gave up trying to get the camera to focus on this, my bad. And tweezers really come in handy for moving your wires around in a precise manner. To get rid of internal dust on the fan and the board, it's a good idea to have a soft, clean paintbrush. This is a gentle way to remove debris. And for scrubbing down plastic parts, you can't go wrong with a nice toothbrush. I'll talk about this later, but attached is a MediaFire link to how to format your SD card. This one from Walmart seems to work really well. And you're going to need a GameCube. This tutorial is for the DOL001, or the original model GameCube. As far as I know, there's 3 different models of the GameCube, and the Pico Boot can be applied to any of them. The GameCube I'm working with today is Japanese, and there is a region lock between US and Japanese games. Pico Boot will unlock it. But it's not the only way you can unlock region on the GameCube. There is a simpler version if that's all you want to do. As you can see here, this Japanese GameCube has no problem playing Japanese discs. But as soon as I put a US region disc in, here's what happens. My GameCube gets frustrated and pops up an error message. Here, let me show you my Spice Cube. This is a region-unlocked GameCube. It does not have a Pico Boot, but it's simply a wire connecting two ports in the board through a switch. Here you can see it's booting up a Japanese game, and when we click the switch, it's suddenly a US system. Let's give the US disc a shot. Success! Now if that's all we wanted to do today, I would show you just how to do that mod. But the Pico Boot can do so much more, and it's so worth the extra work. Let's get started. Begin by flipping over your GameCube and removing the port covers. We've already talked about the serial port too. If you have it, woohoo, good for you. There are 4 security screws on the outside that you'll need that special screwdriver we talked about to remove. After you remove them, the top of the case should slide right off. Very carefully remove the clips from the front and back portals. You don't want to break these plastic pieces. Now stop and take a quick break and admire your handiwork. I love seeing exposed parts like this personally. There are a lot of Phillips head screws between you and the next layer. Luckily, they're all the same screw, so it's pretty easy to stay organized. Take a deep breath and pull them all right out of the GameCube. There's 4 long small screws above the memory cards. Once they're all removed, you can lift the disk drive right off the top of the system. A note on GameCube disk drives: they're not gonna live forever. As a matter of fact, the majority of them are burning out. Pico Boot is a way to save the life of these systems once those go. Now it's time to remove the heat shield. It has 6 small screws in the top of it, and it is the last thing we will have to remove to get started on the Pico Boot installation. There is thermal paste underneath this heatsink, so a good idea is to run your system for a couple minutes to heat it up. Gently wiggle the heatsink until it comes loose. And voila! Houston, we've made it to the motherboard. I plan to replace this paste, so using a clean Q-tip, I'm carefully removing it from the chip below. I always find this part weirdly satisfying. And I guess I probably should have mentioned that Q-tips and isopropyl alcohol are 2 things you probably should have for this project. I'm using 99% isopropyl alcohol right now to clean up the chips after I removed all the paste. And if there's still paste on your heatsink, remove that too. For those of you who have made it this far, congratulations. Now is where the real fun begins. I prefer to perform this mod with the fan in place. This will hold the bracket that we talked about earlier, and that bracket holds the Pico in place. The lowest port on the Pico that we'll install a wire to is ground, so as long as it fits just to the ground level, you're in place properly. To start, I trim my wires about the length of the GameCube. I strip the plastic off the end of the wire and prepare it for my Pico Boot. I think it helps to thread the wire through the holes in the Pico Boot, so we're starting here with the 3v3 port. In order to ensure the best possible soldering conditions, I'm going to use a brand new solder tip. Over time, these do become corroded, and when they are corroded, they don't work nearly as well as a clean tip. Now that I have my new tip assembled, I'm going to turn on my soldering station. I have my heat set to 419 degrees Fahrenheit. Some people prefer to work with hotter temperatures, some lower, but I think around 400 degrees seems to work well for the GameCube. First, I'll apply some flux to the solder joint, and then I'll apply fresh solder right to the spot where I want it. After a couple seconds, make sure that you tug test your wire. You want these things to be very sturdy so that they don't break off and suddenly stop working just because you jiggled the system. Next, I'll follow the same exact steps as the 3v3, but with this ground port near the bottom left. You may have noticed that I'm soldering these wires to the back of the Pico. That's because the way I have it laid out in my system, it makes more sense for the wires to be coming out of the back. For GP6 and 7, you want to run enough solder that you actually bridge the connections together. You want them to be connected in this case. And it's a good idea to clean up your flux every now and then with some isopropyl alcohol. The last 2 connections on this Pico are going to be GP4 and GP5. Make sure that your solder is not touching between the two of these, because if you accidentally bridge this connection, the Pico won't work at all. And I apologize for it getting out of focus. Sometimes the fumes from the solder cause bad focus. Great, we have the Pico done. It looks a little bit like Rava from Legend of Korra, in my opinion. Now it's time to connect this bad boy right into the board. This is probably a good time to mention that the number one reason a Pico Boot doesn't work is because someone left their wires too long. The maximum length these wires should be is 4 inches. I've included a diagram to the side so you can see where each of your wires needs to go. You're going to want to trace them through to the corner of the GameCube because that's the only place they're going to be able to get through the heat shield when we reassemble it. This ground connection, like GP6 and 7, is the only other bridged connection, so you're going to be bridging 2 pins together here with this black cable. And for this next connection, I thought I was filming, but I wasn't. But this is GP5, and it's very similar to the 3v3 cable we just did, so go ahead and connect it to the point right there. Now for the last 2 solder points, these are the most difficult because you're going to be soldering right into the leg of this chip. You don't want to bridge any of these legs, so be patient. You may have to redo it a couple times. I know I did the first few times that I did them. And remember that your soldering iron is hot. Be careful where you hover your heat. You don't want to damage anything on the board while you're frustrated with this part. But now that we've made it through all of that, congratulations, the hard part is done. Let's test our work before we reassemble it, just to make sure everything's running properly. The Pico Boot with this kit comes pre-flashed, but you do need to set up an SD card. Format your SD card to FAT32. There are a bunch of files that you need to go and get to fill this to make it run properly, but to save you some time, I've included a MediaFire link in the description. It contains all the files in a Sage Cube, except for the games. Go ahead and download all of those files, and you're just going to want to drag and drop them right into the root of your SD. If you don't know what a root is, it's just the first thing you click when you open your SD card. You don't want it in a folder. Pop that micro SD card into your memory card reader or your SD to SP2, and go ahead and power it up. If your logo isn't purple, you're golden. It looks like we got it right on the first try. My system is going to boot right up to Swiss, but if yours doesn't, and for whatever reason you get the standard GameCube logo and then it just errors out, then probably what you need to do is go back and shorten your wires. If you're confident that your wires are short enough and it's still not working, check and see if you bridged any connections. If any of your solder points are touching each other, except for the ones that we specified should be bridged, then just go back, use your soldering iron to separate out that solder. It should work after a little bit of trial and error. I'm gonna let this demo for a while and just clean up my desk because it was giving me a headache. Projects like this use a lot of tools, and it's really easy to make a big mess. But to celebrate getting this right on the first try, I'm going to do something optional. I'm going to change the power LED. I'm going to go with white for this one. If you're not interested in swapping your LED, don't worry about it. You can just skip this section. But changing the LED is easy. Simply remove the front panel, unclip the ribbon cable from the board, and you will see that the LED is held on by these 2 solder points here. All you'll need to do is weaken that solder by heating it up with your soldering iron and remove the light. LEDs have a positive and a negative leg, so what I do is I just pop it on a watch battery here to see which way is positive and which way is negative. Then I'll match my LED to it and bend the legs in the same direction. Next, you just thread the legs right through the holes that the other one came out of, and secure it into place with solder the same way that you were soldering the Pico Boot. I still think it's a good idea to add flux. What flux does is it makes the solder want to go where the flux is. It like lubricates the solder. When you solder without flux, you get a lot of dry, cracked connections that break over time. An ideal solder joint will look shiny and smooth. Next, use some wire cutters to trim the legs, and then go ahead and plug it back into your GameCube and see if it works. Ah, beautiful. A swapped out LED is a good indicator that someone has worked on the system, so it's kind of my calling card. The other thing I like to do is take the metal tray that's beneath the disk drive, and I take this front corner here and bend it up with some pliers. The reason I'm doing this is because it will provide a nice space for the wires to go through and not get pinched by this metal tray. A lot of times you can have a perfectly working Pico Boot in the test phase and then you reassemble it and it doesn't work, usually because the wires got pinched. Some people wrap their wires with heat shrink tubing. I think this also will protect them. Remember that thermal paste we scraped off earlier? Well, let's go ahead and put some new butter on these pancakes. These thermal pads have been cut to the exact micron of the size they need to be, so just place them on the corresponding chip that is their size. And obviously don't forget to remove the plastic film that's on either side of the pad. Man, now I really have a craving for some buttery pancakes. Now, those last two tricky wires that we put on the chip are dangerously close to where the heatsink goes, to the point where if you put the heatsink directly on them, it will short them. It's a good idea to include some sort of barrier between these wires and the heatsink. Heat-safe tape works, or I'm just going to go ahead and put some electrical tape in that area. The first few times I made Pico Boot GameCubes, I didn't know about this, and my games worked initially, and then slowly started to short out, and then the Pico Boots didn't work at all. So it really is an important step. Once the wires are protected, we can screw the heatsink back in. You're in the home stretch now, but you do need to be careful. You're going to want to thread the wires from your Pico Boot into that spot that we bent earlier on the shield below the disk drive. As I reassemble, between each layer, I like to test the Pico Boot by powering it up and making sure it still works. Once I confirm it works, then I move on to the next step. Combining the disk drive tray, followed by the power unit, and then the Pico Boot can be a bit of a snug fit. But once you get it all together, all you have to do is replace the million screws you took out at the beginning. Here's the best close-up view I could give you of my wires. They come flush through from the board right up to the Pico Boot, and they're not pinched or touching anything they shouldn't be. Continue returning the screws to your Pico Boot. And remember to be careful when you put the front and back panels into place. Now you can carefully glide the top cover right back onto the GameCube and snap it into place. Give it one final assembly power-up test before you return the game bit screws to the outer shell casing. Let's see if we overcame that region lock. First, let's test a Japanese disk. Okay, works great. But can it run a US region disk? Oh yeah, it certainly can. Earlier I mentioned that the disk drives of the GameCubes are all slowly dying. The major benefit of using a Pico Boot is that it can run off flash, or files, on your SD card. You can install a Pico Boot into a system that doesn't have a working disk drive. But if you're lucky enough to have a working disk drive, there's something extra special you can do with it. I included a plugin called CleanRip. What this does is it creates a backup of your disks in a digital format. So if your disk drive ever does go, you could still have your entire library at your disposal without ever having to use the disks. I'm using my Pico Boot to create a backup of this Naruto disk. Now I have a file of it right on my GameCube. As you can see, the game is still running even when I remove the disk from the system. And this extends right into gameplay. I'll never have to put this disc into this GameCube again because the file is right on my SD card. Also, I had never heard of this game before and I wasn't that excited about it, but it turns out it's actually pretty fun. So there you have it. That's a beginner's guide to installing a Pico Boot into a GameCube DOL001. I've had a lot of people ask me to build these for them, and while I can't make them for everyone, at the very least I'd like to give you the information that you need to build them for yourself. If there's anything I can do differently in my tutorials, just let me know in the comments. And please remember to like, comment, and subscribe.